Fine. So, good morning, everyone. Fine. Just a minute. Fine. So, good morning, everyone. My name is Arafat, and I teach history on the Testbook platform. So, in this session, let us spend some time discussing a very important topic of modern Indian history, that is the impact of the colonial rule, that is the impact of the British rule on the forest societies. The impact of the British rule on the forest societies, that is on the people living in the forested regions. The people living in the forested regions. So just a minute. I hope everyone have joined. Let just a minute. Let's take a look at the chats. Fine. Just a minute. Fine. So good morning, everyone. Once again, to all the students who have joined in today's class. So let us spend, I was telling that let us spend some time discussing the impact of the British rule on the forest societies. How did the forest people got affected during the British rule? Let us understand that particular point. So the point is, take a look at the the resources that the forest provided to us. Basically, we underestimate the value of the forest. But the point is, most of our daily needs, they they come from the forests. So, for example, the paper we use, the furniture we use in our forest, we use in our homes, all directly comes from the forest only, because the timber is used in the manufacturing of a paper, in the manufacturing of a furniture, etc., etc. That's the point. So, for example, the bamboo, which also comes from the forest, is also used in the paper manufacturing process. Bamboo is also used in various societies to fence their houses. That's the point. Even today, in the villages of India, fuel wood continues to be used for cooking purpose. The fuel wood. That's the point. So gum, honey, and medicinal plants. So forests are also home to numerous uh, medicinal plants. That's the point. So the point is, all our everyday products, they come from the forest only. The second point is, forests are also rich in biodiversity. So we all know that greater the biodiversity, greater it is for the climate stability. So if we want the climate to remain stable, we should do whatever we can to promote biodiversity. And forests, incidentally, happen to be the places with the abundant biodiversity. That is, abundant diverse life is found within the forests. But the point is, deforestation began taking place from the beginning of the 18th century AD. From the beginning of 18th century AD, deforestation has been taking place, and the deforestation was directly a result of industrialization. So you all might be knowing that it was in the 18th century AD that industrial revolution broke out in England. Industrial revolution started in England. So with industrialization, the pace of deforestation also began to increase. So for example, between 1700 to 1995, between the time period between 1700 to 1995, 14 million square kilometers of forest had been cut down to meet the needs of industry, to bring more land under agriculture, and to bring more land under pastures. Between 1700 to 1995, between these uh, 250 or 300-year time period, 14 million square kilometers of forest has been cleared to meet all of these needs. That's the point. Then what is deforestation? In simple terms, deforestation is the clearing of a forest for other purposes like industries, for agriculture, for converting land into pasture lands. We call it as deforestation. What is the simple definition of deforestation? It is basically clearing of forest uh, and making way for other needs such as industry, agriculture, etc. is what we call as deforestation. This deforestation was not a new phenomena. Deforestation has been happening since ages, but the intensity of deforestation certainly increased during the colonial period. During the colonial period, that is the British period. Let me explain this once again to you. The point is, deforestation is not a new phenomena at all. Deforestation has been happening in India and in other parts of the world since ages, but the pace of deforestation, the intensity of deforestation certainly increased during the British times. So, the topic of today's discussion is the impact of the colonial rule on the forest societies. The impact of the colonial rule on the forest societies. So that's the topic of today's discussion. As part of that discussion, we are now taking a look at different aspects in which the forest societies got impacted. So the point is, I just told you that deforestation has been happening since ages, but the pace of deforestation, the intensity of deforestation increased during the British times. Why? What are the reasons? One is land expansion. So the point is, take a look at this statistic. In 1600 AD, that is in the beginning of the 17th century AD, only 1/6 of the land of India was under cultivation. In the beginning of 1600 AD, that is in 17th century AD, only and only 1/6 of the land of India was under cultivation. 1/6 is say roughly 17% of the total land. But now in 2024, more than 50% of the land of India has been brought under cultivation. The point is, 400 years ago, only 1/6 of the land of India was under cultivation. But in 2024, close to 51% of the total land available in India has been brought under cultivation. And this expansion in cultivation happened as a result of deforestation. The point is, forest began to be cut and more land began to be brought under plough. So reason number one for deforestation is expansion of land under cultivation. The expansion of the land under cultivation is a reason number one for deforestation. But what is the need for bringing more land under cultivation? The point is, in 16th century AD, the population was low, the population was very limited, and therefore there was not much of a need, there was no need to cut down the forest. But with time, population exploded, the population began to increase, and to meet the food needs of the people, more and more forest lands began to, more and more forest began to be cut down and converted into agricultural lands. So the point is, I told you, deforestation has been happening in India and elsewhere, that is in other parts of the world, for a variety of reasons, for numerous reasons. But I told you that deforestation, the process of deforestation certainly got intensified during the British time. The first reason for the deforestation is the expansion of land under cultivation. Reason for expansion of land under cultivation is, as population increased, uh, there was a need to meet the food demands of the increased population. So therefore, more trees began to be cut down, and more and more forest land begins to be brought under cultivation. So the first reason is expansion of land under cultivation became reason number one for deforestation. Second, I told you, deforestation intensified during the colonial rule, during the British rule. Take a look at the reasons. So the point is, the various British policies, the various British economic policies in a way led to deforestation in India. The British economic policies in a way greatly played a role in the deforestation in India. Take a look at some of those policies. One, the British introduced commercial crops in India. The British introduced or promoted commercial crops in India. So, for example, in 18th century AD, in the middle of 18th century AD, a part of India came under the British rule, and by the turn of the 19th century AD, that is by the beginning of 19th century AD, that is by about uh, by, by the beginning of 19th century AD, that is by 1810, 1820, by 1810 and 1820 AD, large parts of India was already under the British control. And by 19th century AD itself, the industrialization process had already begun in England, and there was a lot of demand in the industries of England for various products like jute, cotton, etc. Let me repeat this point once again for you. The point is the process of industrialization had begun in England. England happened to be the first country to experience industrialization. So, as a result, there was a lot of demand for various commodities to be used in these industries of England. And therefore, British in a way began forcing Indians to cultivate numerous crops like jute, like cotton, etc., etc. And by 19th century AD, population also began to increase in Europe. By 19th century AD, population also began to increase in Europe, and therefore the food needs of the people of Europe also began to grow up. The food needs of the people of Europe also began to increase. So therefore, British, who already were in power in India by the beginning of 19th century itself, began putting pressure on the peasants of India to cultivate the crops which were in demand in the European markets. So the point is the British forced commercial crops on the Indians. The British began forcing the Indians to carry out the cultivation of commercial crops like jute, sugar, wheat, cotton, etc., etc., to meet Europe's rising demand for raw materials which were needed for its growing industries. I told you that industrialization process had already begun in England. So the industries of England needed more and more raw material for manufacturing goods, and the raw material for manufacturing of those goods began coming from India. So the point is, as the demand for all of these commodities increased, the British began encouraging cutting down of more forest and began bringing the forest land under cultivation. So the point is, it was, I just repeated, it was during the British times, it was as a result of the British economic policies, the deindustrialization process, the deforestation process intensified from the 19th century AD. Got the point? So the deforestation process got intensified from the 19th century AD. The first such reason is a forcible introduction of commercial crops in India to meet the needs of the British industries. That is reason number one. Second, the British viewed forest as unproductive wastelands. Quite ironic. The point is, the British viewed the forest regions as wastelands, unproductive wastelands. So they encouraged deforestation with a view to increase their revenue. The point is, more the land under cultivation, greater is the opportunity for the British to collect taxes from the people. In the forested regions, the British cannot collect any taxes, particularly the land revenue, and therefore, with a view to increase their revenue, the British began encouraging people to cut down the forest and bring more and more land under cultivation. So the British deliberately with the view to increase their land revenue, began going ahead with deforestation. For example, between 1880 and 1920, just in a span of about 40 years, 6.7 million hectares of land, the forest land, was cleared for cultivation. So the point is, the British viewed forest as unproductive wastelands. Very ironic. The British began to argue that they can increase their revenues by bringing more and more land under cultivation. So, if more land is under cultivation, the British could collect land revenue from the peasants and thereby increase their revenues. And therefore, only with the intention of increasing their revenues, the British began encouraging the people to go ahead with deforestation. I just told you the statistics. Between 1818 and 1920, that is just in a span of about 40 years, 6.7 million hectares of land was cleared for cultivation. That became the second important reason. The third reason is deforestation was also a result of uh, deforestation was also carried out to meet the needs of the Royal British Navy. Deforestation in India was also carried out to meet the needs of the Royal British Navy. So the point is, British was one of the most powerful. British had one of the most powerful armies by the beginning of the 19th century AD. Its military strength, by and large, depended on its powerful navy. That is, let me repeat, by the turn of the 19th century AD, British emerged as one of the major military powers in the world. The military strength of the British majorly or mainly depended on its navy. In fact, of all the countries of the world, uh, British had one of its most powerful navy. It had a very, very powerful navy. And to construct ships, to build ships, uh, high quality timber was required. To build ships, high quality timber was required. And unfortunately, uh, from the beginning of the 19th century AD, the oak tree availability in England began to come down. That is, oak forest. Britain has large swathes of oak forest, and this oak tree was used for the construction of ships, for building of the ships. But by the beginning of the 19th century AD, the availability of oak trees in England began to fall. The availability of oak in England began to come down, and therefore, immediately the British. The point is, maintaining a powerful navy was a prerequisite for the British to have its to continue. The point is, the strength of the British depended on its strong navy. Stronger its navy, stronger will be its military power. I'm talking about the British. So the point is, the British did have a very powerful navy, and to build ships, the British used timber, particularly the oak trees, for constructing the ships. But the point is, by the beginning of the 19th century AD, the availability of oak tree in England began to fall, and therefore, immediately search parties were formed and were sent to India to look for good quality timber. So the point is, from 1830s onwards, large scale cutting of the trees was carried out to meet the needs of the British Royal Navy, the Royal British Navy. Let me repeat. From 1830s onwards, teams were formed to look for high quality timber in India, and these teams identified those forests with good quality timber. And from 1813 onwards, large scale deforestation began to be carried out, and these trees were cut to meet the needs of the Royal British Navy. So the third reason for the deforestation in India during the colonial times is uh, the Royal British Navy. That is, to meet the needs of the Royal British Navy, deforestation began to be carried out. Fourth is the railway expansion. So in 1850s, the British started laying the railway lines. But why did the British develop railways? Was it to benefit Indians? The answer is no. The point is the British developed railways to efficiently exploit the mineral resources of India. The point is the British wanted to very efficiently transport the minerals of India, the minerals from the interiors of India to the port cities of India, from where those minerals were exported to England. Let me repeat. The point is the British developed railways not to benefit Indians, but to further their interest in India. For example, the British developed railways to efficiently transport the minerals from the interiors of India to the port cities of India. So the minerals were first loaded into these trains, into the racks, through which they were transported to the port cities. From there, they were transported via ships to the regions in England or Europe. So the point is the British developed railways to further their economic interest in India. And second, the British developed railways to efficiently deploy the military from one part of India to another part of India. The point is the British developed railways for two reasons. One, to further their economic interest in India. Which economic interest? Basically, they wanted to very efficiently transport the minerals from the interiors of India to the port cities. That is reason number one. Second, to basically they developed railways to very efficiently deploy its armed forces from one part of India to another part of India. That was the reason why the British developed these railways. And these development, the development of railways in India essentially began in 1850s. But the railway development also in a way led to deforestation in India, because to run the locomotive is basically the rail engine. To run the locomotive, now we have a diesel, or some locomotive, they are basically they are run through electricity as well. But back in those days, the locomotive was run with fuel wood, or wood was used to run the locomotive. Wood was used as a fuel to run the locomotive. That is, I'm talking about 1850s. So the point is the development of railways in India also had a role to play in the deforestation of India. How? Basically, to construct the railway line, to construct 1 mile of railway lane, we need close to 2000 sleepers. What are sleepers? Let me repeat. To construct 1 mile of track, we need 2000 sleepers. Sleepers means these are the wooden logs that uh, hold the railway tracks together. Basically, sleepers are the wooden logs that keep the railway tracks together. And to construct just a mile of the railway track, we need close to 2000 sleepers. The point is, in 1850, the construction of railways began, and by 1946, over 50,000 kilometers of railway tracks. By 1946, 50,000 kilometers of railway tracks had been laid. 50,000 kilometers of railway tracks had been laid. At the point. As a result, what happened? Large scale deforestation began taking place in India. So the point is, the British introduced railways in India not to do any kind of good to Indians. The British introduced railways to further their interest, but this development of railways also had a negative impact on India. Negative impact being it resulted in large scale deforestation, because to construct railways large quantities of timber is needed, because the point is to lay just a kilometer of railway track, you need 2000 sleepers just for 1 kilometer of railway track. And by 1946, the British had laid, that is just before independence of India, 50,000 kilometers of railway track was already laid by the British. 50,000 kilometers. And to construct the railways, the British began going ahead with deforestation. They began cutting trees. This became the reason. Fine. Still like me, that's all right. But next time, make sure that you attend. My apologies uh, for the last class. There was a technical glitch, so therefore my laptop got hung. Therefore I could not take the class. Fine. So all the students, make sure that you attend the class uh, at the exact time. We meet at 11:30. Make sure that you attend the class exactly at 11:30. Fine. See, Lakshmi, I have shared the French Revolution PDF. You can download the same from the Telegram app. Fine. So the fourth reason for deforestation during the colonial time is railway expansion. The fifth reason is introduction of plantations. The point is, in Europe there was a lot of demand for tea, there was a lot of demand for coffee, there was also a lot of demand for rubber. So therefore the British began converting natural forests into tea, coffee and rubber plantations. The point is, there was a lot of demand for tea, coffee, and rubber in the European markets, and therefore the British began converting vast quantities of natural forests into tea, coffee, and rubber plantations. That became another important reason for deforestation in India. So, take a look at the reasons for deforestation. The reason number one for deforestation is as the food needs of the people began to increase, more and more land began to be brought under cultivation, and essentially more land was brought under cultivation at the expense of the forest land. That is, forests began to be cut down and were converted into forested regions. As a result, deforestation began taking place. So, reason number one for deforestation is uh, increased land under cultivation. That is reason number one. But I told you, deforestation in India proceeded at a rapid pace during the colonial times. It was largely deforestation in India was largely a result of the British policies. Example of those British policies is one, the British encouraged commercial crops to meet the needs of the people of Europe. British deliberately began encouraging deforestation, and they began deliberately encouraging the people to bring more and more land under the cultivation of crops like jute, cotton, wheat, sugar, etc. Because these crops, these commodities, these crops were in great demand. These commodities were basically in great demand in the European markets, and therefore the British began encouraging commercial crops. The second reason is a revenue increase. Third is uh, there was a lot of demand for timber coming from the Royal British Navy. That's my point. So to build good quality ships, you need timber, and the availability of good quality timber in England was declining, and therefore the British began looking for good quality timber in India, and they began going ahead with cutting down of forests. That is the third reason. The fourth reason is the railway expansion, which we just discussed. Fifth is the establishment of plantation. So the point is, natural forests began to be cut down and began to be replaced with plantations like tea, coffee, and rubber. This became another important reason for deforestation. Now, take a look at the rise of commercial forestry. This was also a new uh, thing during the colonial period. So the point is, the rise of commercial policy, the rise of commercial forestry was also uh, a result of the colonial rule. That's the point. So basically, by 1850, that is by the middle of the 19th century AD, the British realized the importance of a forest, because the point is, the British began depending on forest for timber to meet the needs of its military, and also to meet the needs of the railways. Let me repeat. By 1850, the British began realizing the importance of forest. They began realizing the importance of forest because the British by 1850 had begun to depend on the forest to meet the needs of its army, because ships were built with high quality timber, and second, they also depended on timber for maintaining or constructing railways. At a point. So the British were worried, the British were indeed worried that indiscriminate use of forest uh, would, the point is, indiscriminate use of the forest would ultimately destroy forests. Let me repeat this point once again. By 1850, forest became indispensable to the British because the British depended on good quality timber from India to build ships. The British depended on good quality timber from India again to build railways. And by 1850, the British were indeed worried that indiscriminate use of forest would ultimately destroy forests themselves. And therefore, they appointed in 1860s, in fact, in 1864, the British appointed a German expert by name Brandis as the first Inspector General of a forest in India. In 1864, the British appointed a German expert by name Brandis as the first Inspector General of a forest in India. That's the point. So why did they do? Because they wanted to safeguard forest. They realized that if they don't protect forest, or the indiscriminate use of a forest would ultimately destroy forest, hampering its economic interest in India. So therefore, they began looking for an expert who can guide them in safeguarding the forest. They found an expert in Brandes, who happened to be a German. He was appointed as the first Inspector General of India, Inspector General of Forests in India. And this man Brandes, uh, uh, Brandes in India promoted scientific forestry. So on the recommendations of Brandes, scientific forestry, quote unquote, scientific forestry came to be introduced in India. That's the point. So the objective of this scientific forestry was twofold. Let me repeat. With the purpose of safeguarding forest, this man, that is Brandes, introduced in India uh, a concept called scientific forestry. The scientific forestry was introduced by him with two objectives. It, its objectives were twofold. One is forest regeneration. The second is to meet the British Empire's demands for timber. The point is, I told you, British Empire was highly dependent on Indian timber for its navy and for building railways. And this man, with the view to safeguard forest, came up with a concept called scientific forestry. He introduced this scientific forestry with a twofold objective. One is to regenerate forest. That was the first objective. The second objective was to meet British Empire's needs. At a point. But most scholars now, including most scholars, including the ecologists, now believe that the so-called scientific forestry introduced during the British times is not at all scientific. The point is, Brandis was the one who recommended introduction of scientific forestry in India, but the present day scholars uh, severely criticize the so-called scientific forestry introduced during the British times. The scholars of the present time believe that the so-called scientific forestry introduced during the British times was not scientific at all. Now take a look at the aspects of scientific forestry introduced during the British times. One is systematic plantation was introduced under scientific forestry. Systematic plantations. Basically, diverse tree species were cut, because the point is the forests in India were natural forests, and these natural forests were quite diverse. So there was a great diversity in the plant species in India. But under this scientific forestry during the British times, the diverse tree species were began to be replaced with single species plantations. The point is, diverse tree species began to be replaced with single species plantations. Which treaty? Which trees? Mostly teak wood and salt trees. Teak trees and salt trees began to be planted by replacing diverse tree species. But why were only these two plants introduced? Why was the cultivation of only these two plants encouraged? The point is, teak and sal, they are hardwood trees, and more importantly, they grow quite straight, which British wanted to meet the needs of its navy, and also to help in the construction of the railways. So the point is, the forests in India are known for great diversity in its species, the plant species. But in the name of scientific forestry, the British began replacing these diverse tree species with the single species plantations, which were planted in rows. These trees, single species trees, began to be planted in rows. Particularly trees like teak and sal trees were preferred, because these are hardwood trees, and second, they grow quite straight, and British found these trees to be very useful in the construction of high quality ships, and second, in the construction of sleepers. I told you, these are the wooden logs that hold the railways, the rail tracks together. So what was the outcome? The point is, in 1864, Brandis was appointed. Immediately from 1864 itself, the scientific forestry was introduced. Under the scientific forestry, uh, diverse trees began to be replaced with single species trees. But what was the outcome? It resulted in loss of biodiversity. So biodiversity that was available in India, biodiversity, that is the diversity in the plant species in India, began to take a hit. So there was serious loss of biodiversity as a result of this so-called scientific forestry introduced during the British times. Then again, with the purpose of safeguarding the forest, the point is, I told you, by 1850 the British realized the importance of forest, because without safeguarding forest, they cannot meet the demands of its navy and railways, and therefore they began appointing these experts like Brandis. So the point is, under the same scientific forestry, the British also began coming up with forest legislations. Under the same scientific forestry, the British also began to coming up with forest legislations. The first such legislation was in the year 1865, later amended in 1878 and 1927. Got the point? So the whole point is, the objective of these forest laws was to protect the forest. Quote unquote, protection of forest was the objective of the forest laws. That's the point. So under these forest laws, the British classified the forest into three categories: reserved, protected, and village forest. Let me repeat this point once again. The British began realizing the importance of forest, and therefore, with a view to protect the forest, they began coming up with legislations. One such legislation was the Indian Forest Act 1865. That was, in fact, the first legislation introduced by the British in relation to the forest. So, under these forest laws, the British classified the forest into three categories: reserved, number one; second is protected; third is village forest. So, the reserved forest was not meant to protect the trees themselves. The reserved forest was declared to be forest that needs to be used by the British alone. Basically, reserved forest happened to be the most valuable forest which the British had specifically set aside for exclusively to set aside exclusively for the colonial needs. Let me repeat the point once again. Reserved forest does not mean the British had declared them only for the protection of trees. No, that was not their intention. The first reserved forest, they were declared to be the forest uh, that would be used only for the colonial needs. At the point. So in reserved forest, the entry of the people was banned. So basically, the entry of the people in the reserved forest was banned by the British. So the trees available in the reserved forest were meant to be used exclusively by the British. So which type of plantations? Mostly teak, sal. So these trees which were grown extensively by the British, these no forests were declared to be reserved only for the British, and the people were banned entry into those forests. And second category of forest is protected, and third category of forest are village forests. People of the villages and forested regions were given limited entry into these forests. Under the forest laws, the British allowed limited entry of the villagers and the forested people into the protected and village forest. Whereas in reserve forest, the entry of the people was completely banned. Whereas in the protected and village forest, the entry of the people was allowed, but only to a limited extent. The people of the villages were allowed to enter into these protected and village forest only for a limited, no, only to meet their limited needs of timber for house construction, fuel wood, and fodder. I hope I am clear. So the point is in just a minute, in protected and village forest, limited entry was available, whereas in reserved forest, entry of the forested people and village communities was completely banned. The British classified forest into three categories under these laws, which the British began introducing post 1860s. That's the point. So, what was the impact of these laws on the village communities? What was the impact of these legislations, these policies on the local communities? So, it led to loss of forest resources. The point is, traditionally, the forested people and the villagers depended on forest to meet their needs of fuel wood, fodder, fruits, roots, leaves, honey, gum, etc. etc. Let me repeat. Traditionally, the people of the forested regions as well as the villages depended on forest to meet various of their needs like fuel wood. That's the point. Fodder, fruits, roots, leaves, etc. But since the British declared reserved forest out of bounds for the common people, so the point is the point is these forest laws introduced by the British uh, deprived the people of the forest of all of these resources. Understand the point? The point is the people of the forested regions were not allowed entry into the reserved areas at all, and therefore, as a result, the people of the forested regions and villages began to they were deprived of all of these you know uh, all of these products of the forest like fuel wood, fodder, fruits, roots, leaves, etc., etc. So the first impact on the local communities is the loss of forest resources. Traditionally, the people of the forested regions depended on these forest resources for their livelihood, but because of these forest legislations introduced by the British, the people of the forested regions began to get deprived of these forest resources. That is the first impact on the local communities. The second impact on the local communities is the conflict over forest use began. The conflict over the forest use began. This is the second impact. The point is the people of the forested regions and the people living in villages close to that of the forested regions prefer mixed forest. They preferred mixed forest because the point is greater the diversity in the forest, the people can depend on those forest for meeting their needs. So for example, in a forest patch with diverse trees, it can provide it can meet the needs of the people living in its nearby areas. So for example, there is a patch of a forest with the diverse trees. People near living nearby that of people living near that forest can depend on such a forest for meeting all their needs. So the point is the village people, they preferred mixed forest. If the forests are mixed, that is if the diversity of trees in the forest is great, those trees can uh, meet the needs of the people living near such forests. But on the other hand, the British prioritized single species plantations. So therefore, there was a conflict over the forest use between the people living close to that of the forested regions and the British. Just a minute. So the point is, what was the point of a conflict? The point is the people wanted a forest with mixed plants because greater the diversity of plants, greater is the possibility of those forests providing goods to the people of that region. But on the other hand, the British preferred a single species plantation. So as a result, a conflict began erupting between the British and the people living close to the forest over the forest use itself. That is the second impact on the people. The third is the British, under the same forest laws, banned shifting cultivation. So shifting cultivation is a traditional agricultural practice uh, of people living in different parts of the world, including India. Let me repeat this point once again. What is shifting cultivation? Shifting cultivation is a traditional agricultural practice. So in shifting cultivation, patches of forest are cut and burned in rotation. In shifting cultivation, patches of forest are cut and burnt in rotation. Say, for example, this entire region is a forest. This entire region is a forest. People first cut down this small patch of forest. Once the wood get dried up, the entire wood is burnt, and thereafter, on the ashes, uh, people just spread the uh, seeds, and after a few months they would return back to that patch of land to collect their harvest. We call this type of cultivation as shifting cultivation. So the people would carry cultivation in that patch of land for a year or two, and thereafter they would abandon that piece of land for 18 to 20 years for the trees to regenerate once again. And they would again cut another patch of forest and carry the same process. We call this type of cultivation as shifting cultivation. So in India, it is known by a couple of names like Jhum. Just a minute. It is known in India with a couple of names like Jhum, Podu, Bevar, etc. etc. So I hope you all have understood what we mean by shifting cultivation. Shifting cultivation is a traditional agricultural practice in which a patch of agricultural land is cut and burnt in rotations. It is cut and burnt in rotation. So, for example, I told you this entire land is an agricultural land, but only a patch of land. So, this is a patch of land. This patch of land is cut. The wood, once it get dried up, is burnt, and on the ashes that result as a result of burning, so upon the ashes, seeds are just spread out, and after a few months, the people would return back to collect their harvest. But the cultivation is carried in such a land only for a year or two. Then afterwards, that patch of land is abandoned, and another patch of land, another patch of forest is cut, and the same process is continued. Got my point? But the first patch of land is left fallow, is left fallow for 18 to 20 years. There is no cultivation will be carried in the first patch of land, in this first patch of land for 18 to 20 years, for the trees to once again regerminate. We call this type of cultivation as shifting cultivation. But what did the British do? The British, under the same forest laws, banned shifting cultivation. Right? Mind you, the shifting cultivation was a dominant cultivation method in the tribal regions, in the forested regions. And this was the method through which the tribals, the people of the forested regions, cultivated their soil since ages. But the British from 1864 onwards began imposing ban on shifting cultivation under the same forested regions. Reason? The point is the British were afraid that burning of the forest fire, once the patch is cut and once it is put to fire, once that patch of forest is put fire, the fire blaze might spread to the other parts of the forest, and the entire forest may get burnt down. That was the fear of the Britishers. The point is the Britishers wanted to safeguard timber because they began seeing economic value in the timber. Their only objective was to safeguard their timber. So therefore, they had put a ban on shifting cultivation. And this shifting cultivation was banned under the same forest laws. So what was the outcome? The point is people of the tribal regions were depending on shifting cultivation for their livelihood. But once the British banned shifting cultivation, once the British began enforcing this rule very, very strictly, people began to abandon their traditional practice, that is a traditional agricultural practice. At times, people began changing their profession, but at times, because the shifting cultivation began to be enforced quite strictly, in some forested regions, we also see tribal uprisings, that is, people revolting against the British. This also was seen during the British times. That's the point. So I told you that this was we are now discussing the impact of the legislations introduced by the British. One is loss of forest was seen. Then second, conflict over the forest use was also seen. Third, we see that is there was an impact on shifting cultivation. So people began. There was a great impact on the people when the British banned shifting cultivation. That's the point, because that was the traditional method through which the British carried cultivation. I'm sorry, that was the traditional method through which the tribes carried cultivation. When that was banned, naturally, it began affecting the livelihoods of the people, and sometimes people also began revolting against the British. So, under the same forest laws, the British banned or put hunting restrictions. Under the same forest laws, the British had also put hunting restrictions. What happened is the forested people, they depended on uh, uh, hunting. Some tribes depended on hunting for their survival. That is, some tribes, they depended on hunting for their survival, but the tribes usually hunted small animals. They usually hunted small animals like deer and other small animals available in the forest. So, under the same forest laws, the British banned hunting. But hunting of what? They banned hunting of small animals. But quite ironic, very, very ironically, the British encouraged big game. They encouraged big game. What is big game? Big game is basically the hunting of wild animals. The point is, under the same forest laws, banned the British banned hunting of small animals by the tribes, while at the same time the British encouraged big game, that is hunting of wild animals. But why? Why is this contradiction? Why did the British ban hunting of small animals, and why did they encourage hunting of wild animals? What is the reason? British basically believed large animals as a sign of primitive societies. British basically, who were in power at that time, they believed that large animals is a symbol of primitive societies. And British basically believed that by killing these dangerous wild animals, they could civilize India. Basically, they believed India to be a country. They believed that Indians were uncivilized people. The British believed Indians to be uncivilized people. The British basically believed large animals as a sign of primitive society, and they believed that by killing those wild, dangerous animals, they can civilize Indians. They can civilize India. So, therefore, they began declaring rewards for people who can hunt and kill these wild animals. So, basically, the British turned big game into a sport. Big game is hunting of wild animals. They turned hunting of these wild animals into a sport. In fact, they began giving no rewards for those people who hunt these wild animals. What was the impact? The point is, as a result of this British policy, many wild animals were pushed to the verge of extinction. So, for example, between 1875 to 1925, as a result of this uh, 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 British policy, 80,000 tigers were poached and killed, 150,000 leopards were killed, and close to 2 lakh wolves were also killed. So the point is, on one hand, the British, under the same British laws, banned the hunting of small animals, and this ban on hunting of small animals had a great impact on the livelihoods of the people, because many forest communities, they depended on hunting of small animals for their survival. But this ban on hunting of small animals began to greatly negatively affect the people of the forested regions. And second, the British, very ironically, encouraged big game. They encouraged hunting of wild animals. As a result of this policy, uh, some of the animals were pushed to the verge of extinction. So, for example, tigers. Its population almost became extinct by the time India became an independent country in 1947. Because between 1875 to 1925, 80,000 tigers were killed. British themselves encouraged. 150,000 leopards were killed. 2 lakh wolves were killed. At a point. In fact, the British began rewarding those people who killed all of these wild animals. At a point. So, what was the overall impact of all of these British policies? The overall impact of all of these British policies is revolts, the tribal revolts. So, from 1850s onwards, we see large number of tribal revolts in India. We see people of the forested regions revolting against the British. That is the outcome. So the whole point is, in today's class, we have spent time discussing the impact of the British rule on the forest societies. How did the people of the forested regions get affected is what we have discussed. Got the point. But what was the overall impact? The people of the forested regions got fed up with the British rule. they began taking up arms and began revolting against the British. And we see this trend particularly from 1850s onwards. So from 1850s, we see numerous tribal communities, for example, say Santhals, for example, say uh, Khonds in Odisha, Santhals of Jharkhand, at a point. So all of these tribes began taking up arms and started revolting against the British. This is what has happened. Fine. So that's all for today. That's the end of today's lecture. But in case you have any doubts, you may start asking questions. Any doubts, anyone? Any doubts, anyone? No doubt. Sri Lakshmi. Fine. So that's all for today. See you in the next class.